The final wave had arrived. It included the biggest and baddest, the strongest and the fastest. However, there were still a few that were quite weaker, feebling-looking greens. No doubt they were used as cannon fodder, like the other waves before them. Several kids were swearing and talking rapidly. "Bloody bastards!" one kid angrily yelled. "Have we tried reasoning with them?" one kid jokingly said. "Kick them in the nuts," another kid yelled. "Don't give up hope," Brock shouted. He may have used up all of their ammo, but they still have a few tricks up their sleeves. Just stay away from the cars. The cars? What the heck was he talking about? Luna wondered, but realized that was the least of her worries. The final wave of greens were ready to strike. Luna gripped her axe tightly and glanced over to her sisters who were doing the same with their weapons. She quickly scanned the crowd for any sights of her target. The gap was getting smaller again, and Brock yelled at the kids to charge, and they did just that. They were all struck with a sudden jolt of courage. They just beat this wave, and it's all over. Luna raised her axe and brought it down to the head of the adult male, who was carrying a bent piece of metal. The impact of the ever burnt up her arm, but she was too filled with adrenaline to notice. Another green quickly filled its space, only to be cut down as well. Another one finally approached, only to be chopped down by a tree hacked at by a mad lumberjack. Her clothes were beginning to get stained with blood, and blood was dripping down from her face. Luckily it wasn't hers, not that she would have noticed if it was. She was lost in battle as her axe rose and fell onto the skull of adults. "Die, motherfuckers! Die, die, die!" She didn't realize that she was saying this out loud, but she realized that her arms were already getting tired and sore. She was also aware of a few kids beside her, cutting away as she was. She quickly stepped away to give her arms a break. She was about to glance over at her other siblings when one kid beside her, a boy who looked a little bit younger than her, was stabbed in the neck by a green, welding-jagged piece of metal. The boy stood next to him cried out as he splattered with blood and sprayed out the boy's wound like a sprinkler. Luna swore and rushed over to help. The wounded kid was dragged away by another, weaker-looking greens, who ripped him open like a birthday present. Luna reached to the adult who looked far away for a second. He turned. Luna cut him down before he even realized that he was there. Those adults might have been the fastest, but the other kids were still faster and still gave him the slight advantage. Luna gave the other kid, who was sprayed with blood now being attacked by a tough-looking green, who looked like a stereotypical truck driver, heavy built, long beard, and was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans with a mesh cap. His fingers were planted in the kid's mouth. Against the roof in the bottom, he was pulling as if he was trying to rip the kid's jaw open. The boy was screaming and crying. Tears were washing the blood-stained cheeks. Luna had to help. She rushed over and chopped down the green. The head of the axe hit him in his neck, and as he loosened the grip on the boy, and the kid dropped to the ground. Unfortunately, the blow wasn't as fatal as the trucker, at least from what she assumed it was. He was nuts and started to try to rip out the kid's mouth open, like King Kong struck her with a closed fist. A bright flash filled Luna's vision, and a wave of pain traveled through her head. She was on the back, resting peaceful black blue sky, a stark of contrast with bright blood that covered the earth beneath it. She quickly came to her senses and fought the pain as she lifted up the trucker, removing the axe from his neck. Ignoring the blood that dribbled down his shoulder, Luna's eyes traveled to the kids, whose life was just saved, whose jaw was dangling as it had been dislocated. He was trying to crawl away, but didn't get far as he was dragged away into the mass by greens, undoubtedly to suffer the same fate as his friend. So much for saving him. Luna turned her attention to the trucker, who was now marching at her with the axe held tightly in his huge hands. Luna's eye darted away frantically for her sisters, but they were nowhere in sight. She tried to call for help, but all that escaped her mouth was a quiet whimper. The trucker raised an axe to Luna, who was too scared to look away. Then a flash of metal of a colored teal appeared in the corner of her vision, and the trucker dropped the axe as blood began to drool out of his mouth. Luna then noticed a streak of silver traveling through his neck and then slid it away. As he held forward, Luna shuffled away in the direction to realize the blue streaker. Her heart filled with joy as she saw Sam standing right next to her welding katana. A blaze in fire, fear filled her eyes, and she looked just how she was whenever she was on stage, gargling guitar riff. She looked at Luna and then offered her hand, and Luna took it without any hesitation. "Thanks," she said. "That was sick." "No problem," Sam replied. "Just call me Sam the Samurai." Luna wanted to blush and giggle like a dork, but then she quickly remembered that they were in the middle of the frickin' war. She hurried over and picked up her axe. She had forgotten all about the pain that throbbed about from being punched. She was filled with new energy. She looked at Sam and they both nodded. They charged at the army of grown-ups. There was no time to be timid. Luann Loud was a girl, bubbly, upbeat personality. At least that's what she wanted most people to think. Right now she was more scared than she ever had been. Even at the beginning, she was still running away from the adults at the high school. At least she could run away. She couldn't run away. She had to fight. Lives were on the line. If she did even ran away, where would she go? There was any place safer than being surrounded by people who care about you and willing to fight by your side? Not only would she run away, but she would never abandon her siblings. She hated to think about her life without her siblings. At least she had to ask herself, what if they didn't exist? What would she do? She'd be miserable, no doubt. She loved having her siblings. They were all there and would do anything to make her happy, like put up her April Fool's Day pranks and silly puns. She knew that she loved seeing her family happy, because once she overheard siblings talk about how much they couldn't stand her puns, decided to give up comedy, and when she found out she did everything she could to try and make puns again, Lincoln was on stage at that chortle portal. Of some of her jokes ended up making a fool of himself. Her siblings were a gift. They were precious to her because without them, she wouldn't have no outlet. No way to hide her pain of being fear of alone and friendless from her pranks. She loved them and was willing to face her fears and risk dying here, right now if it meant keeping them safe. The thought of fighting to protect them gave her the confidence she desperately needed to fight this horde. She gripped her spike club. She was aware of Maggie right beside her. She was the dual-wielding pair of the large Bowie knives. She twirled them both in her hands as some of the teens Greens approached. It was kind of impressive. She didn't look afraid, but there was no way she wasn't. Luann looked at her around for her siblings, but they were nowhere in sight. She just had to hope they were okay. It was her and Maggie as well as a few other random kids. Several of others were taking it to the adults, but the adults were still in the force to be reckoned with. Maggie suddenly sprung a scrawny adult woman who got too close, stabbing her in the eye. The lady didn't even know what hit her. She then continued to slash away at more adults who closed in on her. The knives were dancing and filling the air with red moist of blood. Luann was so transfixed by the sight that she didn't even notice an adult male who had his sights on her. He had a set of arms wrapped around her arm as they continued to drag her away. She screamed and turned in the direction of she was being pulled by a fat, bald man with droopy, wrinkling face that was trying to drag her into the mass of greens, where she would no doubt be ripped apart. Luann struggled against the man and beat him with her mace, but she couldn't get a good hit on him. Maggie was a second, stabbed him in the back of his head, killing him instantly. Luann fell backwards and Maggie stood in front of her as if to protect her. Her head was darting back and forth, as if she was scanning for more adults who could be foolish enough to attack her. At least they'd be cut to ribbons. Apparently one of them, a shirtless male, who was wearing boxing shorts and boots, tackled Maggie to the ground. Maggie fought desperately to try to get the grown-up off of her, but he was too strong. He kept trying to bite her, but she kept bobbing her head left and right to avoid his teeth. Luann just sat there stunned. Maggie had an empty, angry, yet panic-stricken on her face as she gave it all to hold the adult away. "Luann, help!" she finally managed to say, which snapped Luann out of superior. The sheer panic and desperation in Maggie's voice gave her the sudden jolt of courage as she sprung up, grabbed her mace and charged at the adult. She brought her mace down with every last strength and hit the adult in the back of the head as he went limp. Maggie quickly shoved the adult out of her way and lay there sprawled out on his back. Luann studied the adult as Maggie got to her feet. The adult was wary and tough looking. The only thing that stood out to him besides his boxing attire was his hair. He was bald at the top of his head with a thick, brushy, curly hair all around the sides, back of his head. He looked just like Larry Fine with the Three Stooges, but he realized that it made Luann want to burst out laughing. She quickly stowed her amusement and turned to Maggie. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," the dark-haired girl answered. "You?" "I'm fine," Luann answered. Although she popped in her head, she fought and turned to the dead green, pointed at her mace. "However, he's not fine." Luann then laughed harder than she'd had in the past month. Maggie raised her eyebrow. Luann was wondering if she even thought she finally cracked. Luann then raised her mace. "Come on, let's go mace these green-ups up." A look of delight filled Maggie's eyes. Could Luann finally be back to her old self? Lynn was exhorting herself even more than she ever had. The Iron Club was breaking bones and cracking skulls left and right. If these greens were afraid, they'd probably be scared shitless of the little Jacques. But they knew no fear. They would only knew to kill, maim, and feed. Lynn was aware of Cooper and some of the other kids giving her a lot of space. Getting hit by Iron Club would be worse than being devoured by a mob of greens. Lynn's body was screaming for her to take it easy, but she ignored it. She'd take it away easy when she's dead. She wasn't so sure how many greens she killed, but at this point, if the wave was anything like the last two, she had the way to go. She couldn't even keep this up forever, but she refused to stop. Stopping would mean admitting defeat, and Lynn Loud Jr. was no quitter. To die was to lose, and to stop was to quit. She'd rather lose than quit. Her long-sleeved baseball shirt was stained with blood with the top of her fallen foes. It was no longer white, and the number 1 on the front was no longer visible. Before today, that number meant that she was number 1. But now that significant her desire to be the last thing standing, and she not wanted anyone else to die, especially her siblings. Her vision was of her standing amongst thousands of dead bodies, while her family was hidden away safely, someplace far away from this nightmare. She was going to protect her family no matter what, and if that meant she had to kill every last of these greens, she'd gladly stand where they were at night, swinging away at the ever-increasing presence of bodies. She was a machine, and her body was moving faster than her brain. Anything that green filled her in sight was immediately struck down. Then the adult of the big green had came in storming in right at her. She held her back up then, and then swinging as hard as she could, expecting to splatter like a tomato, but it didn't. Instead, the club bounced off of their head and set a spasm of pain coursing up her entire arm. She swore loudly and stumbled backwards, trying to make sense as to what happened. She quickly realized that thing she hit wasn't a head, but a helmet. A football helmet, to be exact. It was the same shade of green as the skin-diseased teenager who wore it. Lynn swore, and her eyes darted to the side, and saw the other kids dealing with countless other greens. She would have had to also deal with this one herself. The green charged at her again, and Lynn quickly pondered what she should do. Run or fight. She kicked herself even considering running away. But at the same time, she wouldn't be running away to hide. She'd just be running until she could figure out what to do with this green. The green was right on top of her. Its head was bowing down as if it to ram her. Then an idea struck her. She quickly stepped to the side, hit it at the back like a bullfighter as it passed. The spikes dug into the back of its neck right below the protective pads, shielded its upper torso. The teen grunted and stumbled to the ground. "Oi!" Lynn was about to run up to him and give the final blow when she was suddenly hauled backwards. The unexpected jerk caused her to drop her club and struggled to break off free of whatever had seized her. The football player was suddenly back on his feet before he was about to charge at her again. Lynn screamed for help as the deceased teen went into a full-on sprint. Lynn tried her best to wriggle free from the captivator. Even if this teen ran into her, he'd probably end up breaking all of her ribs. The teen was about to slam her into something when something slammed into him, knocked him off course. His shoulder ended up crashing into the shoulder of whoever was holding Lynn, and they both toppled away. Now Free dove forward away from the teen, picked up her iron club in continuous motion. She quickly took a glance away from the football player and saw Cooper lying on the ground with his mouth wide open. Rolling from side to side, kicking his legs, Lynn recognized those indicators. He most likely got the wind knocked out from him. Poor thing was something feeling Lynn or anybody could ever get used to, no matter how many times it's happened. Lynn suddenly remembered that the green rammed into her just more seconds earlier. She had looked back at the football player getting up, while the green that she had been restraining her seems to be having trouble. His right arm was dangling limply as if it had been dislocated. Lynn was suddenly too terrified to imagine how much worse her injuries could have been. Instead, she gripped her club tightly. Her red, blood-stained knuckles were turning white. As the football player charged again, he was strong and fast, but wasn't as smart because as soon as he got too close, Lynn simply stepped aside and this time letting the teen hit his shins. There was a loud snap as the teen tumbled over again, and Lynn pounced on him and soon ripped his helmet off, leaving his head exposed. Lynn brought her club down to his head. With all of her might and fury, there was a loud crunch that the teens out of the game. Lynn hollered and held in fist first in the air of the celebratory gesture. Just then she quickly turned to the green that had grabbed her before. His right arm was still dangled, and he was reaching out with his left. Lynn admired tendency, but she was out of the league. She had held out her club like a baseball player and delivered the final blow, sending the green twisting away. He then turned his attention back to Cooper, who was beginning to stand up. She stand up as well and thanked him. "I owe you one," she said. Cooper smiled. "Please, just don't get grabbed again. I don't think I could stand tackle to another grown-up again." "Don't be a baby," Lynn joked, forcefully patting him on the shoulder, making him wince. She then turned and faced the horde. "We're still far from finished." Stan then stood with his mace gripped firmly. Behind him was Mary holding a large dagger. She was eager to help, but Stan had told her to stay close behind him. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her happen to him. Next to him was Shade holding a machete, and his eyes were darting back and forth, up and down for some reason. Shade really wished that he hadn't smoked before the battle. He told himself he needed to be alert and ready. However, he wished that Mary Jane was right beside him, speaking the words of encouragement. Even if she wasn't real, her words meant nothing. She was all he had. Even though he was surrounded by dozens of kids and countless dead bodies, he felt like the loneliest kid in the world. Stan stood still, waiting for another adult to come to his way. He wasn't going to risk stepping up to the horde. He had already seen a few kids make the mistake of getting too close and drag into the mob. Suddenly, he heard the sound of something heavily metal rustling in the crowd. He looked to see a tough-looking male approach him holding a long metal of chain links. A kid had tried to rush the adult, but the grown-up just ended up whipping the kid in the face, sending him spiraling away as blood sprayed out of the wound it caused on his face. Another kid who looked bold only appeared to be whipped across the face too. Then another kid, whose glasses wore, stepped up, wielding a slingshot. Stan recognized him. His name was Franklin. He took aim and was about to fire when a weak, long-looking female green grabbed him by the arm. Franklin was about to let the ball fly, and it struck the green in the chains from the arm. He angrily looked to see who hit him, and saw it was Franklin, shoving the adult who grabbed him into the ground and stomping its head until its skull was crushed. Unfortunately, he was caught up and to notice the green with the chains approaching him. He shouted at Franklin to watch out. By the time the boy with glasses looked up, it was too late. The green whipped his chains, a light right straight across his face, knocking his glasses off as well as his nose. Franklin screamed louder as Stan heard him scream before he fell backwards. The surrounding green seized the opportunity and swarmed at the defenseless boy, devouring him in mere seconds. Stan just stood there gawking. He felt great shame for not being able to help these kids who had been knocked down by the greens with the chains and get eaten alive by another greens. The rustling of the chains suddenly brought him back to the present, and he looked to see the male adult approaching him. His eyes were cold, his face was covered in several cuts, wounds that were most likely caused by the kids who changed before him, only to suffer the same fate as Franklin, or maybe sometimes had trouble controlling the change trajectory. Stan then gripped his mace determinedly. No way he was going to run away. This green was going to pay for what he did to Franklin and the other kids. He was exact aware of Mary next to him. She had seen the damage of this grown-up could conflict on what he was just scared as he was. Shade held up his machete in both hands like a lightsaber. It looked ridiculous as always. The green was about to strike, but Stan had charged him. The grown-up lashed at him with all the chains up, and Stan held his mace to block the attack. The chain ended up wrapping around his weapon, and the green heaved, and the chain pulled the mace right out of Stan's hand. A sudden jerk had caused Stan to fall forward, the mace landing next to him as it became untangled. The green was about to whip Stan when Mary called out his name. The green looked to see Mary was charging at him, with Shade right beside her. He held up her dagger like she was going to strike the grown-up. But the green wasn't afraid of her. He pulled the chain back and lashed out at Mary. The chain struck her right across the cheek, striking her like a bolt of lightning and sending her spiraling backwards as a red mist briefly filled the air around her. She had dropped to the ground as the blood began to gush from her cheek. Mary just sat there, stunned as she placed a hand to her cheek, then realized how badly she had been hurt, and the high-pitched scream of pain escaped from her mouth. Shade had stopped dead in his tracks, and his eyes darted away from Mary and the grown-up in the chains. Every time he looked back at Mary, more and more blood streamed down her wound as she stared at the green grass red. His face had become even more pale as it already was, as he just stood behind her like a statue, not wanting to suffer the same fate as her, or anyone else for that matter. Stan, however, was a different story. The bomb inside of him was finally going off, and every ounce of rage he had saved for the Loud siblings was about to unleash on this poor, unfortunate green. He shot up like a predator, sprinting into the bush, and slammed into the green just as it turned back to him, knocking him flat, even though this green was twice as Stan's size. Stan was angry, and the green had not been expecting this. Stan had always heard stories about the biggest people to get knocked down by the smallest people if they were suddenly struck without warning. Stan summoned the strength. He didn't even know how he delivered the series of punches to the grown-up's unprotected face, knocking his hand from side to side, breaking his nose in the process. The green suddenly resigned his composure and bared his teeth. For some reason, Stan had noted that this adult still had braces, even though he looked up in his mid-30s. The adult tried to shove Stan off of him, but the adult wouldn't budge. He wasn't going to give this green much of an inch. He was just going to pin him down and punch him until his brain oozed with a broken skull. Shade knelt by Mary to try and calm her down, but she was a wreck and she could not stop screaming. Shade had looked around for someone to help, but all the kids around them were too lost in their own battles to notice them. He then looked to Stan, who saw he was still punching the shit out of the green with his chains. Shade had called out to him, but Stan was completely enveloped in beating the green's face in. In fact, he was too focused on killing the green that he didn't even notice more greens approaching him. Shade tried to momentarily abandon Mary to help Stan out. As he ran as fast as he could, he swung his machete swiftly, hard enough to decapitate one of the approaching greens. He had shouted at Stan again, and the boy looked up in time to see that he was about to be swarmed. He then reached for his mace and held it on top of the mace that was facing down to deliver forceful blows until the green was completely caved in. Stan then got up and studied the green for that moment. It was a testament of rage to need to protect the only person that mattered to him anymore. That caused him to jerk his head back towards Mary. She was still sitting on the ground, screaming and crying as the blood continued to flow from her cheek. The male was quickly approaching her, as its mouth began to open upon a wicked grin. Stan grunted loudly in anger and stormed towards Mary, striking the green that dared approaching her, wiping the smirk off of his face completely. He knelt down to Mary's level and his face went from blistering fury to cool compassion. Mary was too busy screaming to notice him. He didn't even know if she was still screaming because of the pain of being whipped, or was it from the horrific sight of the blood gushed from her wound like a fountain. He wasn't too eager to find out. All that mattered was getting Mary out of there and fixing her wound. "Mary? Mary!" Stan frantically called out to her to get a look at him, but he couldn't match her screaming of how it was becoming gargled due to the blood. He then placed a hand on her shoulder to get her attention. She looked at him with fearful, tearful, stained eyes. It's okay, I'm here." Mary's eyes were filled with tears, but she looked relieved to see that Stan was okay. Don't worry, he told her softly. I've got you. He then put her hand under her left arm and hastily, yet gingerly, lifted her to her feet. Her face was beginning to get pale, as she had trouble standing up. He had draped one of her arms around his neck and began to shuffle towards the entrance of the school, away from the battlefield. Shade tried to help, but Stan had told him that he had it covered and he just had to get back out and fight. Shade reluctantly agreed. He felt bad for letting Mary get hurt like that, but he wondered what it would be if it was him. Stan would have fell forward after trying to attack the green with chains. He hesitated in trying to come back to aid. Mary then stepped up before him and then charged at the green, which caused the Shade to follow pursuit. But the next step made the difference now. Mary was injured. Shade was by himself, holding only his machete. He scanned the crowd for a familiar face, spotted Joey with his axe taking it on the greens. Shade decided to go and help him out. Not that he needed it. Ethan and his best friend Lexi were showing the princess and her army that they weren't afraid of. They worked in perfect synchronization. Ethan chopped down on the greens with his sword. He believed it was to be called a saber, as a curved blade with the lever grip. Any green that approached him was quickly cut down. The army was thinning out, and he and his group were doing it. They were no doubt of them. They were all tough kids just like him. They continued to hack and slash. The only main goal was to kill the princess. Lexi was mowing down greens with her double-headed axe. She grunted at every swing. Her muscles were bulging. She was a strong girl and could kick anyone's ass. When she was little, she tried playing sports with boys, but they always refused to let her play with them because she was a girl. Every time this happened, she'd make them regret for not letting them play with her playing with them. She challenged them all and beat them so badly that they refused to let her play with them, all because she was too good. She didn't care, though. Don't disrespect anyone who doesn't respect you. That was all what her dad told her. She missed her parents. They always encouraged her to never be afraid of anything, to which she always tried to do. But right now, however, she was afraid. Afraid of dying, which was the worrying what she was worried about. She was afraid of everyone dying except when you're staring down at countless adults who are trying to rip you apart, to tend to get you more than afraid, to get you terrified. But with all you could do fight through was the terror and survive. Live to a fight to another day, even though for the terror until there was nothing left to fear. At least she didn't have to fight alone. She had Ethan with her, and she loved him like a brother. She said her brother because that's what she felt like, and she compared him to. She wasn't attracted to boys, only girls. Ethan knew this, but he didn't care. He just liked her just the way she was. She was always so kind to her. They'd only been friends since elementary school, and she thought it was cool. He'd always let her play sports with him. Too bad there weren't ever girls like her into sports, as she was. But there was a little brunette girl who was to wear a baseball shirt that had long red sleeves, who almost got in a fight with Ethan on the day they arrived at Royal Woods. They may have been whatever's called tomboy, but Lexi still thought it was cute and couldn't help but wonder. A grown-up suddenly took a swing at her, a wooden leg that looked like it had been ripped off by a table. Luckily, Lexi was able to dodge and retaliate with the swing of her own, taking the top of the grown-up's head. Focus, Lexi told herself. There had been plenty of time to sort of feeling better later. Right now what mattered was defeating the adults that had chased him out of this home state of Indiana once and for all. The princess was losing what little patience she had. Why there wasn't any much peasants taken care of yet? How come it could be killed a couple of nobodies? Her subjects were strong, loyal, and eager to prove themselves to her. If that were the case, she would be feasting on her blood at adversaries by now. She spotted another younger pheasant making its way towards her. She was stained with blood, and her fallen subjects and their eyes were set on her. It made her a little uneasy. She knew her royal subjects wouldn't let her down. Ethan was filled with rage, as she was dressed in pink, sitting on her throne, being cared like a princess she thought she was. She thought he had news for her. She wasn't a princess anymore, as she was a frickin' Easter bunny. Lexi called out after him as he made his way towards the grown-up, but he ignored her, cut down the green after green after green. Nothing was going to stop him from killing that bitch. He didn't care that if he died. What are you waiting for? Kill that boy, the princess called out to her subjects. She was beginning to panic, which was uncharacteristic of her, but it did look like that boy didn't care if he were died. And someone who isn't afraid of dying isn't the most dangerous type of person. She had shifted nervously upon the litter, looking down at her subjects that were holding her, as if they were completely oblivious to what was going on. They only knew how to carry her, but not how to fight, and she looked most upset and embarrassed if any of them were to be cut down, causing her to tremble to the ground. They would be absolute the worst thing to happen to her. Well, besides being killed. The boy inched over closer, causing the princess to lose her composure. I said, kill him, you useless, insolent. Ethan was only a few yards away. She was covered in cuts and bruises, but he didn't care. None of that mattered because once he killed that bitch, he slashed away at the few remaining greens that stood between him and his target. It was just him and her. He had noticed the panic on her face and gave him the great satisfaction. The only thing that could feel better than that would be seeing her dead. Die, bitch, he yelled, raising his saber. Princess held her arms out to protect herself. Ethan was about to plunge her sword into her chest when he felt the pressure of his own chest. He stumbled backward and looked down. The sword had been driven into him. He just stood there in complete disbelief. Damn, I was so close. He felt his arm lowering the saber, eventually letting go of it. He then heard Lexi scream his name. Ethan turned to look at the adult who impaled him. It was a big, blurry man with a crew cut. Ethan opened his mouth to swear at the adult, but all that came out was a stream of blood. But quickly removed the sword from Ethan's chest as he fell backwards. Tears began to fill his eyes. He stared at the blue skies as there were a few feathery clouds there and there. Blue and white just like the Colts, his home team. He was suddenly back into Indianapolis with his parents, enjoying a stroll through the city. There was no place he'd rather be. Serves him right, the princess thought. How does he think he could kill me, the princess? She then turned and studied their fallen subjects, and then turned to her bodyguard, who had just saved her from that awful peasant, who just needs some mindless drones. Have you got to be a strong man? She then turned and heard an awful high-pitched scream that aggravated her to the core. She looked to see another peasant looking over her. She then looked at her with a big strong bodyguard, pointing at the approaching girl. Kill her too, and I may let you touch me. The bodyguard grinned and savagely began to advance on the girl. Lexi was distraught. Her best friend was dead, and she could tell that it was that bitch's fault. Lexi even hated her for existing. She was going to kill that pink bitch no matter what. She gripped her axe tightly and continued to charge. When she saw that Green had killed Ethan, was willing to kill her as well. No matter, she was determined to do the same to him. He swung his sword at her, and she swung the axe with his sword. Apparently this man was just like all the others. He'd underestimated her strength. She hit his sword down with such force that it went flying out of his hand, and ended up sparing one of the adults, who was carrying the princess litter in the head. She ended up falling to the ground, and the litter fell to the ground, causing the princess to tumble off of it. The bodyguard was shocked. He angrily turned to Lexi, who grabbed her by the shoulders. Even then, he underestimated her. She broke free from his grasp and headbutted him, causing him to stumble backwards. She then swung her axe and decapitated him. Blood shot out of his neck like a fountain, and his body fell backwards. Lexi turned his attention to the princess, whose pretty pink clothes were stained with blood and dirt. The princess began to look up at her, but nothing but panic in her eyes. Lexi was going to enjoy this. She looked around the ground to make sure there were no surprises waiting for her, but all the princess's subjects were too distracted to try to find the other kids from Lexi's group. It's just me and you now, princess, Lexi smirked as she marched right up to the terrified princess, who held up her hands as she was surrendering. Lexi swung her axe hard as she took off the princess's hands, causing blood to squirt them off too. The princess made a gasping sound as she looked at her arms, shocked that her beautiful, elegant hands were no longer attached. Then Lexi butted her mouth at the wedge of the axe, knocking out several of her teeth in the process. The princess looked around, and all but her teeth lay scattered on the ground. She then returned her gaze to Lexi, as she was begged her to help her stop. Lexi wasn't going to show any mercy. That bitch had followed her the group all around from South Bend, Indiana, for crying out loud. She could have left them alone, but she didn't. She deserved what was going to happen to her. She then hit her again with the axe wedge, this time hitting her cute little nose, flattening it. The princess was knocked on her back. Blood was gushed from her flattened nose as the princess brought to her arms her nose to hold it, but quickly forgot that she didn't have any hands. Lexi was then pressed her foot down the princess's chest to keep her from squirming and raised her axe. The princess held her arms as if she was begging to be spared. It was quite pathetic, really. Lexi brought the axe down, every ounce of strength she could muster, and the prince crushed the princess's skull, ending her region of terror once and for all. "Did you feel that?" Crony asked Chris. "Feel what?" "Someone powerful just died." "Who?" Chris asked, slightly concerned. There was no way that it could have been any more powerful than thinking he was, like the one with the sledgehammer. "I don't think it was anyone we knew." "Are you sure? Are you positive?" Hard to tell over the clatter. Everyone's talking at once. Chris rolled his eyes as to why he was worried. The kids had run out of ammo for their guns and they were getting weak, and they could all just win like he always did. Joey was something to behold. There was an absolute wrecking of the machine with his axe. Any green that dared to get him closer was massacred. There was even a reason every kid at the school had feared him. He felt invincible. No measly green was going to kill him. All around him were dead greens. Some kids even got too close for him for his safety. He felt like carrying them kind of annoyed him, but at the same time it made him feel like the powerful kid on earth. No one could challenge him. No one. The one kid's pothead behind him now was too impressed with Joey's special ability to go on a rampage and not get tired. Some of the kids began to appear by Joey's side and cover his flanks. He was too valuable to lose. He also thought that made him feel special. If they kept this up and worked together, they could win. They could be at finish in no time, and since it was a shame, because Joey was really hoping for a challenge. "Randy, look out!" someone screamed. Joey and several other kids looked. At the same time, Joey wondered if someone who screamed could have been more specific. Several other adults were surrounding him, exactly what Randy would be looking out for. "Oh shit!" A tall, muscular, welding sledgehammer was barreling straight towards Randy. A weird boy who shouted names of random movies and actors. Joey then sprang forward to try to save Randy, but it was too late. Even Randy had a hard chance to react to the towering adult, swung his sledgehammer into Randy's head. The poor kid's head exploded like a bomb had gone off inside of it. "Holy Gallagher, Batman!" Shades exclaimed, as he dropped his machete down, holding Rand back towards the school. Several other kids followed suit, all of them screaming to their heads off, scarred by what they had just witnessed. Joey had yelled at them, but they ignored him, so much so that he said nobody was going to run away. Oh well, at least it sounded cool. Joey then turned back to the adults, who towered over the surrounding adults. He must have been one of the two kids called the Tower. Joey gripped his axe as he and the Tower made eye contact. He felt like a creeping smile on his face. Meanwhile, the Tower's face was cold and emotionless. "Great," Joey said. "I was hoping for a challenge." He then charged at Tower, still invigorated by before. Lana had made it. She kicked the air duct open and was now at the roof of the school. She made her way over to the parapet and looked at the battlefield. What she saw made her stomach roll. All the front of the school were dead bodies of kids and adults. Several of them were still up to fighting. She knew that this is what she wanted when she got up there. But she didn't make it very easy. She needed to focus. She came up there for one reason only, to kill Grease Monkey. The question was, where was he? He could be long gone by now or dead. Lana hoped it was the latter. The thought of Grease Monkey still roaming the earth made her sick, which made definitely saying something. Come on, Lana. You can do this. Just think of it as Where's Waldo? The game she played with Lola several times. Plus, there was the fact that the whole mechanic repairman, when your job is fixing stuff, learning even the spot of the tiniest of... Lana's heart stopped when it couldn't be. It was just too easy. It was only for her a couple of seconds. Expect to have to scan the battlefield several times over. But nope, he was all over right. She wasn't imagining it. Like the nightmares of where adults were, every adult was Grease Monkey. There was no mistaking him. His tall, looming figure, dark, greasy hair, his mechanic uniform. Grease Monkey was still alive.